This is House Planning Help, episode 16.
Have you always wanted to build your dream home? Maybe you know what you want. But what if it could be better? HousePlanningHelp.com. Speaking to the experts, searching for better ways, planning for the future, build a better home. HousePlanningHelp.com podcast.
Hi, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and in this session, multiple guests, but no interview. It's because we've got our first Google Hangout.
HousePlanningHelp.com.
Hi, and welcome. Thank you very much for downloading our 16th podcast. And it's an interesting one because it's a debate session today that we've already held on Google Hangouts. At the time of recording, this is still a relatively new technology, but I was keen to use it, particularly because what I love about it is that you can connect people from any location and have a debate. It's a good forum. This one will only be an audio discussion, but we're hoping at a later date to have a video discussion. It will be on another topic because we'd like to do this every few months, or if there's a need that arises, because some things are quite clear as the route that you should go down, and others you have to make up your own mind, so hearing different viewpoints will really help. Today's subject is about heritage and sustainable design and finding that balance. We're posing the question, what's more important, preserving heritage architecture or retrofitting it to high energy efficiency? We're going to concentrate on old houses. I'm saying that they are earlier than 1910, around the time the building technology has changed. But of course, we'll talk about all sorts of buildings, no doubt. And I started by getting each of our panellists to introduce themselves and to find a bit more about them and their background. First up, Adam Dadabai.
Well, I'm a passive house consultant and have been involved in some of the early passive house, certified passive house projects here in the UK. I've also done postgraduate studies at the Centre for Alternative Technology. Before that, I worked in different fields. I worked in IT for the last 10 years before I became involved in the built environment. And I've recently also co-authored a book called The Passive House Handbook, which is published by Green Books.
And then we have Roger Hunt.
Hello, I'm the author of Old House Handbook and the soon-to-be published Old House Eco Handbook, both co-authored with Marianne Sir, and they're in association with the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. And we felt that Old House Eco Handbook was very apt at the moment to tackle the problem of retrofitting solid wall buildings.
And also Ross Atkin.
Hello. I guess I sort of fit in the middle as being just a householder. I don't work in the construction or the green industries, but I'm someone who's got an interest in reducing my home's impact on the environment. And for the last 6 years, we've been working on our house to make it greener and leaner.
Well, that sounds good. Thank you for all those introductions. And let's start, Roger, with a quick question about historic fabric. How important is it? We're not talking about listed buildings, but for other old buildings. Is it still important?
Yes, I think the historic fabric of any building is important. It gives it the character, it gives you the value, and that's why many people buy an old house, and that's why they fall in love with an old house, simply because of the sort of oddities of it sometimes, the skew-if window or whatever, but it is those details that make an old house special.
But does a house not develop through its lifetime? So if it does need some energy efficient measure, then that is also just part of its history.
Oh, exactly. Yes, you can add in extras, and actually our villages and townscapes have grown up because of the accretions that have been added to old buildings over many, many years. So, yes, you can add things, but I think you have to do them with care and with thought, and not destroy what you already have in terms of value and character.
But you would prefer to go down that route of sticking with the lime-based technologies if you were going to deal with a very old house?
Well, it's not a question of wanting to. I think it's a question of having to. You cannot introduce cement-based materials into an old house without causing problems, which actually then make the building it's no longer sustainable, and you are going to spend an awful lot of money trying to put those problems right later on, and also you're going to use a lot of extra materials because you're going to have to rip things out and put new things back, the right things back. So lime mortars and lime plasters, lime renders are vital to an old building to actually keep it healthy and keep the occupants healthy.
Adam, I know that you live in a low-energy building yourself. It's one that meets the Passive House standard. It's even a retrofit project. So it might be worth telling us a little bit about that. I know it's not it wasn't a really old building, but maybe just a few details about that.
Well, the original building was built in 1971, and its construction methods were very typical of that time. I would agree completely with what Roger said about not mixing, lime and cement. They're two totally different materials with different properties. I think if you've got a building that breathes, which lime-based buildings do, you need to stick with that in anything that you add to it. The building we had here was obviously not lime-based. It's an ode to concrete, the building I live in. But we added an extension to it as well as retrofitting, and the extension is built in a very different, using different technology. So the appearance fits in with the original building, which is quite modernist, and it's I live on an estate of modernist houses, but the actual underlying fabric is quite different and is breathable. So you can mix side by side. You can't overlay one with the other.
So if we wanted to take an old building and bring it up to a low energy standard, what would we have to do?
Well, I think there is definitely a conflict when you're talking about a building before 1910, a historic building, because often the facade of that building is part of strong part of the character of that building. So you wouldn't want to externally insulate, I don't know, a famous old building, or even a beloved old building that's has a special meaning to its owner. You have to think about some sort of internal insulation, and then you're leaving the outside untouched, but then the inside it gets massively disrupted as well. So you have to really decide where the balance lies on a building by building basis. From a purely energy point of view and from a moisture point of view, it's much better to insulate on the outside of a wall and to sort of wrap the existing building in insulation effectively.
But how far will we actually need to go in the future? This is something that I'm still unclear of in my mind. I know that we can make old buildings energy efficient, but will it be enough? Is our future, does it all have to be very low energy buildings, Adam?
Well, I don't think so. If you define old buildings, or as a very, however you define this category, if it's a small enough percentage, let's say it's 5% or maybe 10% of the housing stock, and if you were able to reduce that 5 or 10%, the energy consumption by say 50%, and the remaining 95% you reduce by 80% or 90% as in Passive House, then you're still going to be in the right place. And of course, I think if you are choosing to live in an old house in an energy constrained future, you have to be willing to live more like the inhabitants of the previous centuries lived in it, i.e. you live at a colder temperature, you maybe retreat to a smaller portion of the house in the winter, and that's how you make it energy saving. If it's not appropriate, or the state in the guise of the planners or conservation officers deem it not to be appropriate, then the alternative is to not try and live a centrally heated life in that house.
That's very interesting, because I suppose in a way old buildings are quite sustainable, because if we do have any energy issues in the future, a lot of them were built with fireplaces and all ready to go. Just moving on to Ross, you have a Victorian house, don't you? So coming to retrofitting this house or trying to make it more energy efficient, was it an easy choice for you to make? And what were those choices that you did make?
Well, I think it's. I think we've touched upon the dilemma of an older house. Is when we bought a house, we had a choice. We could buy a modern house, which would have very low bills, or we could buy a character property that has all the inherent, dampness, coldness, draftiness that we all sort of associate with Victorian houses. Now, the house that we chose is an 1890s semi. It had unfortunately been the victim of some modernisation in the early 90s. So when we bought it, it had some the early version of internal wall insulation where they're dry lined with polystyrene. They'd also used the wrong mortars, so cement mortars, etc. So we had a lot of problems of damp. So as Roger touched upon, a lot of the things that we had to do was actually correct the errors of the past, and that was both in terms of the fabric, sorting out the dampness that was caused by rendering in the wrong type of render, cement rather than lime, and also sorting out the issues around the moisture build-up that they built into the walls through the dry lining. So we're in a bit of an unusual situation where we're trying to put right what was done in the past and try and put back some of the features that are there. So it is a very careful thing because we're looking for a comfortable home. We're not looking for a grand design show home. We're also not looking for a restoration piece. We want something that meets us and our modern lifestyle, but also we're bearing in mind that house temperatures have gone from about 12 degrees up to 19, 20 degrees on average since the 1970s. So we do have to question about, as Adam said, can we live the modern lifestyles that we can in older properties? And I suspect no, there are compromises to be made.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. At this point, I thought it would be interesting to bring in a local example of where a 19th century house is being demolished, and this is one that's actually owned by Tesco. It's called Pontsbourne Park, and I know about it because it's near me. But it really did get me thinking, because what's going in its place is something that's much more sustainable. It's a lower energy building, and at no point did they want to incorporate this old building into the scheme. So it made me wonder whether actually you've got to be careful, because if these old buildings aren't energy efficient, in the future, will there be a case for knocking them down? If we don't make the big savings now, I know that it involves quite serious retrofitting, but Roger, could that be the case?
I think there is a danger of that, because people are not going to want to buy buildings that aren't energy efficient, simply because they're not going to be able to afford to heat them and so on, with energy bills going up. But having said that, I think Adam was absolutely right in saying that we have to learn to live in a different way. And I think, generally we have to learn to put another jumper on and so on. But I think it is hugely important that we do retrofit old buildings, and there is an awful lot that we can do to retrofit them that isn't going to cause damage that is going to destroy the character and value of the buildings. Draft proofing is something that is relatively easy to do and doesn't have a huge impact on the building. A certain level of insulation can be done without having a huge impact on the building. And water efficiency measures and all those sort of things don't have an impact on the building. So we can live a much greener and more sustainable lifestyle without doing a lot to wreck the building. I think every building has to be looked at differently. No old building is the same. Even in a terrace, you have two houses next to each other, and one might be an end of terrace, one might be a mid-terrace. You have to treat them differently. And it's hugely important that every house is understood, and the measures that are going to work with that particular building and that particular house are done in a sensitive way. Yeah,
I think that I personally would love to take an old building up to a low energy standard. Adam, do you think that for the people, we both know a few people who have done this and have taken an old building up to passive house standard, for example, is that good what they have done? Is it something that says this is what you could do in the future? I know what we've said here has contradicted that a bit.
Well, I think the example I think of is there's a Princedale Road in West London. That's a housing association, part of a Victorian terrace, mid-terrace house, and they have made that into a certified passive house. But what they have done is completely gutted the inside, rearranged the levels they've created 4 floors where there were previously 3, and they've effectively built a house within a house.
Yeah.
It's not. I don't know. It's a good example. I mean, it's showing that it's possible to do. But I think it's possibly not a model you'd want to emulate exactly. But it was Roger who was saying just now. You can reduce the air change rate by draft proofing. There's lots of invisible measures you can do. I do think if you've got a genuinely historic building, where the interior is also worth preserving, and you've got solid walls, and I don't really know how you can do that much other than insulating the lofts.
Can I just talk about Princedale Road? I've been there as well, and the point about that building was that it was pretty much gutted inside anyway. Yes. So, although it's an old building, I actually don't see what they've done as being wrong, because there wasn't much to lose by doing it. I'm not convinced that I'm a great fan of passive house, but I'm not convinced that you can do passive house in a house that has lots of features and so on without destroying the character.
No, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. You can't, and so I would certainly, even though I'm obviously having steeped myself in passive house, I'm very enthusiastic about it. I would not in any way ever say it's a universal panacea. There are certain buildings you don't touch. You would never touch them, or you never try and touch them the way the deep retrofit that passive house represents is completely inappropriate. But they are a small minority. I suppose where we might divide, the three of us perhaps, is that in the UK, where there is a bit of a sort of conservation. I don't know, the balance between conservation and actually providing housing that works for people in terms of health and energy costs and the environment is maybe tipping too far towards conservation. The estate where I live on is quite a distinctive estate. It isn't in the conservation area, but it was treated in a kind of semi-conservation area way by the planners during my planning application, and there are lots of houses out there, in my part of the country, which are damp and cold and just unhealthy and really expensive, and people don't like that about their houses, but they're locked into a certain way of living because they're living in a Devon country cottage, or maybe in a poorly built 20th century house.
And what you're saying, Adam, is that there are no other alternatives in your area
to
these types of buildings.
Well, I think I don't know what you mean exactly. Sorry, what do you mean?
Well, you were saying that there are a lot of these damp old houses. Is there an alternative? Is there something modern if they wanted that, or would they have to take their own initiative and go out and build it?
There isn't really much available that's new. I mean, there are a few developer-led new projects in Devon. I mean, generally the problem in Devon is that house prices are very high. Land is hard to come by, and so people take what they can with all of its. Each property with all of its problems. Some people do choose to live in period properties, and they accept that they're living. They're living. They haven't got the same level of comfort and economy that a modern building gives them. But as there are other compensations. So, I mean, that's fine on an individual basis. But I have a little bit of an issue when public policy is to me feels so unbalanced towards preserving the status quo and not really giving something new that's more appropriate to our time now. I mean, even when it comes to new builds, but retrofits as well.
I was about to say, to add to that, I think what we're really seeing is an economic divide, whereby we have a lot of social housing is getting the investment now. So the very poor are now getting much better standard housing, either new housing, or a lot of housing associations are now going for retrofit on a large scale because they have the economies of scale there. On the other hand, you have the more wealthy people who are in a position to self-fund these items, and then in between, what you've got is a lot of people who are not socially well off, but they're not poor either, who are stuck possibly in rented accommodation where it's an owner landlord buy to let type situation, where in the current economic situation they're barely making enough to pay the rent and the mortgage, which means we have a whole slew of people who aren't choosing to stay in heritage accommodation. It's just simply what is available and what they can afford, and aren't the middle classes who choose to buy a lovely Edwardian villa that they can do a refit on. And they're the sort of people at the moment who really we need to communicate the simple things. I'm sure what Roger's sort of mentioned about draft proofing and curtains and those sort of things, but we're not helping. The Green Deal isn't assisting those people, and I think this is where we're really going to start to see a problem with the older heritage stock that we have.
I think education is key to everything that we're thinking about, actually, and I think education is what we're lacking in terms of telling people how they should, or suggesting how people can make their homes better and more eco-efficient. And I think even when they have an eco house, they are very often not understanding how to live in it. Yeah. And I think there is somehow we have to help people and explain. And I think there were some interesting comments that both Adam and Ross made there. Social housing is leading the way in eco retrofits. There's absolutely no doubt about that. They're the people that are experimenting and coming up with the ideas and solving the problems. So we can learn an awful lot from the social housing sector in how we do this. The other thing is that, Adam, you were saying that so many people are living in damp houses and so on. I think actually there's a huge issue there that we need to address before we think about retrofitting, because houses shouldn't be damp, and it seems to me that if there are damp houses, it's very often because of mistakes that have been made in the past. Yes. That have caused them to be damp. So maybe we should also be thinking about how we fix those problems, because actually a damp house is a cold house, a wet wall is a cold wall. So, if we can stop houses being damp, we're actually going to create a much warmer and more environmentally friendly house in the first place.
Yes, I think also a lot of that dampness is caused by errors that were made in the original builds. Certainly down here, there's a lot of this is not historic housing now we're talking about, this is more 20th century.
Oh, okay, yes.
I think with historic housing there is just probably, things are failing after a while as well, and they've been patched up poorly in the past or haven't been addressed at all. But
you do see that as well, don't you, that some of the Victorian housing stock, for example, it's just getting more and more run down, and I don't know. I wonder sometimes whether this is on purpose. I don't know whether anyone wants to pick up on that.
Well, go on, Adam.
I was going to say, there's this little matter of 20% VAT on retrofits. There's a slight, but you go ahead. Yes, you've probably got more to say. There are probably multiple reasons. I mean, it's much more complicated to do retrofitting than to knock it down and do a new build, especially if you've got limited skills in the construction. If the construction sector hasn't got all the skills it needs, and if there's if there hasn't been a sort of national effort to skill up builders to retrofit and to do low energy properly, the easiest solution is to knock it down and start again.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's just old houses, actually. I think it's right across the board with our housing stock. We have run-down houses, and I think there is a big issue with housing in this country that we need to address.
Well, I think that's actually quite a good point to round it up. I don't know whether anyone has any closing thoughts, but I've been slightly surprised by if it almost feels together, this discussion. We've managed to fit all the pieces in. Is that what you feel, Roger?
Well, I think there's a long way to go. But yeah, I think we've raised some of the points, and I think maybe the discussion needs continuing, actually.
Adam, how about you? Any closing thoughts?
Well, just the VAT, I wish we had slightly more support from the state for retrofitting, so there was more of a level playing field between retrofitting and new builds. The planning system is seems sometimes to be quite enthusiastic about retrofitting. Maybe they feel less threatened by it than new builds. But then you've got another part of government saying we're going to add 20% to your bill if you don't knock it down. It's quite a big disincentive.
Doesn't really help. And Ross, are you completed now on your Victorian eco house, as you call it?
These things are never completed, sadly, as anyone who's got an older property will know. But I mean, we're now at a point whereby we've reduced our energy usage by 2/3, and we haven't done anything too radical. I mean, there's a couple of things like the heat recovery ventilation we've put in that you wouldn't normally have in a sort of a typical house, but just by doing sensible things. And I think one of the key things that I know both the two other guys touched upon was it's as much about lifestyle as it is about the buildings. So I could have the world's most economical building in the world, and it could be a passive house, but if I leave the heating on and the windows open and I don't draft proof and I leave all the lights on, it will be as efficient as a coal heated 1820s cottage. So really, we can talk about the fabric, but also we have to change people's hearts and minds. And also, when we talk about retrofit, I think everyone leaps on the grant bandwagon and let's put lots of eco bling on, but really we should be creating decent homes for people, and as part of that we need to be considering the environmental aspects and energy usage, but also things should be clean, dry and healthy, which I think is the primary thing.
Well, I'd like to thank you all very much, and maybe we could just sign off. You could tell us where we can find out more information about, first of all, Adam.
About me or about Passive House, or what do you?
Whatever you fancy. I know you've written the Passive House handbook, so
yes. Well,
where do we get our copy?
You can get a copy from the publisher Green Books. It's also available on online retailers. If you Google Passive House Handbook, spelt the German way, PASSIVHAUS. You will find it, and if you Google Passive House Green Books, you'll definitely find it.
And Roger?
Yes, you can find out more about what I do at my website, which is huntwriter.com, and you can also buy the book through that website. You can buy both books, Old House Handbook and Old House Eco Handbook. But I'd also say if you're looking for advice on old buildings, it's worth getting in touch with the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, because they have a free advice line. If you go on their website and search for free advice, you can get advice on everything from damp to eco measures, and it's free. And that is not just really old buildings, but any solid wall building, and you might find that useful.
And Ross, you even did a blog, didn't you? As you,
I have a blog, yes, the victorianecohouse.co.uk. A riveting read if you have a couple of hours, but mainly to point out that website is not intended at engineers. It's intended for normal people who own an older house, and some of the simple things that you can do, some practical examples of what you should do, and probably more examples of what you shouldn't do.
Well, thank you all for joining our discussion, and we're going to leave it there.
As ever, you'll find all of the links in the show notes, and for this session, it's houseplanninghelp.com/16. If you scroll to the bottom of that page, you can have your say as well. We love all of the comments, and this is quite an important debate, but also a fascinating one, so have your say there. And we hope to host another Google Hangout couple of months down the line, we don't know, we'll see when it happens. I'm particularly excited about the visual side, when we get the video all working, and that we can look at perhaps things like aesthetics and share photos over the Google Plus Hangout. But that for another time. If you are on Google Plus and maybe you're someone in the industry or a homeowner who has been through this and has renovated your property, then you're the sort of person that I want to hang out with on that. So just drop me a line through the website and maybe it could be you on the next Google Plus Hangout. Before we head out of here, I'd just like to ask, if you have a moment, maybe you could rate us on iTunes. It really does help. All of the 5-star reviews have really helped our visibility and us to attract new people. So if you haven't done that yet, we don't ask for much. Please, can you give us a short review on iTunes, and that would be fantastic. And looking ahead to next time, we're talking about ground source heat pumps, particularly in connection to old buildings. My guest will be Justin Broadbent from ISO Energy. So until then, take care.
You've been listening to Ben Adam Smith on the path to build a better home. Sign up now to the free email newsletter. Head to houseplanninghelp.com.